So here is part two for our lecture tonight. We're going to look at our outline. And last week we stopped right at the bottom of the first page where it talked about George Washington and the Christian character of the Continental Army. Now George Washington, of course, is just an amazing figure to study in his own, just in his own right. I feel like you could maybe learn half of everything you need to know about American history by studying the life of George Washington. He's such a formative character and such an example of Christian belief and dedication and courage, and not only that, but he was such a far-sighted statesman. We talked a little bit about that in lesson 13 on George Washington. But today, if we flip to the back side of the paper to B, Valley Forge, the place of refining. And I'd like to comment on that just a little bit. Valley Forge really was the place where the Army was refined. And of course, refining means you heat metal and you heat it up so it melts, and the dross, any impurities, float to the top. They're lighter, the oxidized portion, the bits of impurity rises, and then the refiner will scoop that off by running a metal tool across the surface, and it just sort of adheres, and he picks that stuff off the surface, and then he heats it again, and more stuff comes up. And the more times he goes through this process over and over, the finer and finer the metal is. And so that refining process, the more that you've heated something, and in this case, the more this army was heated and tried, we see that it becomes pure and stronger, and it's a work. Something that is refined is really the work of the refiner. Because a refiner can just kind of do the minimum and just the minor trying and get the big pieces out, so to speak. But as you do it over and over, that character of the refiner is mirrored in that metal. Because the metal is pure and pure, it's gone through more of this. In 1977, 78, it was actually 77, it was December 20th, 1977, my wife and I went to Valley Forge, and it was a very cold day. We got out of the car, it was crystal clear skies, and it was just frosty. That particular day it was minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit, and so it was bitter cold. And we walked over to this big monument, this big arch, Victory Arch, and Marcy took a picture of me, and I stood under this arch, and there was these big icicles, I remember, that were probably about 2.5 to 3 feet long that were hanging off the arch, and they had melted, water and snow had melted off of it, and then it froze and formed this big icicle. And I remember the wind was picking up, and I thought, wow, this is just bitter cold here. And I thought, wow, this is just a bitter place. And while I stood there, she yelled something to me, and I took a few steps forward, getting into the picture a little bit better. and the big icicle that was up there cracked right at that moment, and it hit the ground behind me about 6 or 7 feet away. And I just remember, wow, this is just amazing. I'll never forget this, and I'll never forget how cold it is. And so we went around and we toured the encampment, and we went into the little huts that Washington's men had built, and they have a number of restored, probably about 20, at least back then they did. This was a long time ago. And made out of wood, just exactly like the huts he had constructed with his men. And it was bone-chilling cold, and I thought, wow, I've heard how cold the winter was. And if this is any indication, these men were suffering. And we went into the museum, and they had a beautiful museum and just all kinds of information and exhibits. Really well worth it going to Mount Vernon, to Valley Forge. It's well worth it to go to Mount Vernon as well. But we learned there that Washington's men went into the encampment that day in 1777. And this was December 20th, 1977. So we didn't realize it, but we were on the exact day that he went into the encampment exactly 200 years ago. And I thought, boy, I just will never forget this. And but it was miserable. And so these were the worst conditions that they encountered in the winter. The British had invaded and had taken Philadelphia, pushed Washington's men westward. So Valley Forge is about 20 miles west of Philadelphia. Philadelphia was the largest city in America during the War for Independence, had about 30,000 inhabitants, and Washington's men were out there freezing, and the British were in warm Philadelphia. They just took up residence in the homes and fueled the fireplaces, and the Americans were just barely keeping body and soul together. So in your book, there's a beautiful section, really. If you look on page 154, there's a picture of Washington's men, and you get a little bit of the feel of the cold. It says, due to this lack of food and clothing, this is just under the picture, hundreds of the troops fell sick. Many men's feet and legs froze till they became black, and it was often necessary to amputate them. During most of January and February, there were constantly more than 4,000 soldiers who were incapacitated as a result of exposure, disease, and undernourishment. And so McDowell writes, and in the midst of all of this, they persevered. Beyond this, the patient attitude which they endured this misery was no less than supernatural. Washington wrote, April 21st, 1778, to a congressional delegate, quote, for without arrogance or the smallest deviation from the truth, it may be said that no history now extant can furnish an instance of an army's suffering such uncommon hardships as ours. Their submitting without a murmur is a proof of patience and obedience, which in my opinion can scarce be paralleled. What could possibly have held this army together through this ordeal? Baron von Steuben said no European army could have held together in such circumstances. How then could an inexperienced American army stick together? Was it due to good discipline? With regard to military discipline, von Steuben states, no such thing existed. Could it have been the financial reward they would receive? Not hardly, for their meager pay was already 4 to 5 months past due, and complete payment would never come. What was it then? Most historians agree that the reason for their perseverance at Valley Forge can be attributed to their love of liberty and to their general, George Washington, and his amazing quality of leadership. George Bancroft states that, quote, love of country and attachment to their general sustained them under their unparalleled hardships. With any other leader, the army would have dissolved and vanished, unquote. Now that's Bancroft, who wrote a major history used in the United States in the 1800s. And another great historian, I think, I think he certainly knew Washington well, was Thomas Flexner. And in his book, Washington, I'm trying to remember the title, necessary, I can't think of the title now, indispensable, Washington, the indispensable man. He said the same thing, that without George Washington holding things together, they would not have been able to get through it. His character and encouragement inspired the army to follow his example. From the beginning, he tirelessly traveled throughout the camp, his very presence bringing strength to the men. His heart was for his men as well as for his country. As Washington observed his naked and distressed soldiers, he said, quote, I feel superabundantly for them, and from my soul I pity those miseries which it is neither in my power to relieve or prevent. So another historian mentions this, same page 155. The blood that stains the ground, writes Henry Brown, did not rush forth in the joyous frenzy of the fight. It fell drop by drop from the heart of a suffering people. They who once encamped here in the snow fought not for conquest, not for power, not for glory, not for their country alone, not for themselves alone. They served here for posterity. They suffered here for the human race. They bore here the cross of all the peoples. They died here that freedom might be the heritage of all. It was Washington's character that helped sustain the army, but what sustained Washington? This question could easily be answered by Washington's troops or officers, for they knew his trust was completely in God. The army had frequently seen Washington order his men to attend church and to observe days of prayer and fasting and days of thanksgiving. So, I think this whole section is such a good one, but the character of Washington, very, very, very important to the cause. The deciding factor, most historians believe. The deciding factor. Washington was seen in prayer often. In fact, Benjamin Lossing reports that in his book that Washington was seen at prayer, and Isaac Potts, a Quaker, was out in the woods and saw Washington praying once, and commented that because of Washington's prayer life, he felt that God would grant them success. On page 156, here's his quote. This is in Lossing's book. Quote, if there is anyone on this earth whom the Lord will listen to, it is George Washington. And I feel a presentiment that under such a commander there can be no doubt of our eventually establishing our independence. Let me just repeat there. If there is anyone on earth whom the Lord will listen to, It is George Washington, and I feel a presentiment that under such a commander there can be no doubt of our eventually establishing our independence, and that God in his providence has willed it so. So President Reagan, one of my favorite presidents, my favorite president of the 20th century, said, quote, "The most sublime picture in American history is of George Washington on his knees in the snow at Valley Forge. That image personifies a people who know that it's not enough to depend on your own courage and goodness. We must also seek help from God, our Father and Preserver." So Washington, key to the success. Washington believed and set his hope in God. Now, God's superintendence was also evident. Von Steuben was sent to aid the army, and you know that probably that, or maybe you don't know, but von Steuben, of course, was Prussian, and he was the one who drilled the American troops over and over and over to the point where they could very quickly form lines, stage retreats, move in units. And so this drill that they went through resulted in the American army coming out of Valley Forge able to actually hold its own in the field against the British Army. So he was a key to the American success. Food, the great provision of fish that was sent as the troops were freezing. One day, a huge migration of shad up one of the rivers nearby, the Schuylkill River, resulted in the cavalry being able to scoop up huge numbers of this fish for the men to eat. On page 157, one foggy morning, the soldiers noticed the Schuylkill River seemed to be boiling. The disturbance was caused by thousands and thousands of shad that were making their way upstream in an unusually early migration. With pitchforks and shovels, the men plunged into the water, throwing the fish onto the banks. Lee's dragoons rode their horses into the stream to keep the shad from swimming on out of reach. Suddenly and wonderfully, there was plenty of food for the camp, unquote. France became our ally. That was a miracle that after the victory at Saratoga, the French decided to enter the struggle and come in as our ally. And of course, many historians there attest that even with Washington's leadership and the character of the man, that had the French not come in, giving us aid and also sending men and letting us the benefit of their navy, we would not have won the victory at Yorktown. And so the French tipped the scales, much like the U.S. tipped the scales in World War I when we sent troops over into France to oppose the Germans. The Argonne Forest, those later battles in 1917, 1918 were critical, where the American forces tipped the scales and just provided the winning edge. So France, much like that. George Washington said, following this war, quote, "The hand of Providence has been so conspicuous in all this that he must be worse than an infidel and more than wicked that has not gratitude enough to acknowledge his obligation. So God protected the army as well. So there were miraculous ways that God worked, but also he protected. And maybe the greatest example of that was when Washington's army was bottled up on Long Island, and the British had landed 32,000 troops, the largest expedition in history up to that time. Over 400 ships carrying 32,000 troops, and they landed on Staten Island and then moved over to Long Island, and then the British rapidly pushed Washington's men back to an area of Brooklyn, which is right across the river from New York City. And now with their backs to the river, the East River of New York, it looked like Washington's men were going to be trapped. He had some men in Manhattan. He had split his army. He had some in Manhattan, some in Brooklyn. So he'd made this classic mistake of dividing his army in the face of a superior enemy. And now it looked like General Howe maneuvered and looked like they were going to take Washington's army. Bagged them all. There were about 9,000 there on Long Island. So the battle during the day was fought, and then Howe stopped, and instead of pushing his advantage, and he was urged to do that by officers, but instead of doing that, he stopped and pulled up and decided not to press his advantage and to wait till the next day. Well, the next day came, and Washington realized he needed to get his men away. Colonel Glover's Marblehead fishermen, the famous Marblehead, Massachusetts fishermen, they were boatmen. They were able to pull enough craft together that back and forth from Long Island to Manhattan, they got the army across. And they kept up little fake campfires, and so a number of things went wrong, but nothing was noticed by the British. Major Benjamin Talmadge testified, quote, "As the dawn of the next day approached, and so very dense was the atmosphere that I could scarcely discern a man at 6 yards distance. We tarried until the sun had risen, but the fog remained as dense as ever. I recollect this peculiar providential occurrence perfectly well." And so, between a storm that kept the British ships from going up the East River, and so they could not cut off the American escape, and General Howe, who for no apparent reason delayed this attack for 2 days, and then when he moved, his troops only saw the very tail end of the American troops leaving, and the fog lifted shortly after Washington's men were ferried across. So everything came together for like a perfect escape, and he literally escaped by the skin of his teeth. 3 Americans were captured. All 3 were pillaging the camp and had straggled behind to do that. And they were captured by the British.